This training series for principals is presented by NCPAPA, NCASLD, the Department of Public Instruction, and Education NC. Stick around after the lesson for discussions on the topics we'll cover today.
Even though the NCEES process was developed at a time when no one could have even imagined an entirely remote instructional model, the expectations of teacher practice that are in it, built from the professional teaching standards, are still relevant. And the professional learning that's required and the formative support are still important, and they're still necessary because we have that statutory obligation to evaluate teachers annually. So with that in mind, it's important to maintain the integrity of the outcomes that the evaluation process was designed to produce and to honor the purposes for which the rubric was originally validated. And what has happened now actually is that remote and blended learning models simply expand the landscape in which these attributes and practices now exist.
Evaluating teachers is tough. It's even harder in a remote learning environment. I'm Seth Brown.
And I'm Dawn Ramstor. In this video, we'll talk about the 7 principles of remote instruction, the NCEES process, and the evidences that you can use to gauge your teacher's understanding of the standards.
But first, let's hear from one North Carolina principal about how they evaluate teachers in a remote learning environment.
I know what it takes to kind of keep kids engaged, and it's a lot. I mean, it's a lot. And so we are now shifting to a point where, it's really about talking to teachers about, you are going to have to step it up.
When you think of your highly effective teachers, what are the things they're really able to do well that help them succeed in a remote learning environment?
I can think of one teacher in particular who was amazing at the virtual school. She, highly energetic, created videos, thought about kids, connected with them. Constantly texting through Google Voice, constantly calling parents. Kids would include, if she sent a text message, always included parents with the student in a group. Set up ways that kids could be successful. So she would do like a 2-week module. So you had time as a student to move forward, or there was time for you to take your time and work with her. Constantly creating plans of action, like if you're behind, I can help you get caught up. Let me show you what you need to do. You need to do these 2 assignments today, these 2 assignments tomorrow. Very meticulous in helping students be successful, but setting a high standard, like, yes, you are going to do this, and this is how we are going to do this, but just, relentless in following up with students.
In March of 2020, school as we knew it drastically changed. The shift to online learning has been challenging for many principals and teachers. To help, experts developed 7 instructional design principles that can be applied to this new remote learning environment. Ensuring your teachers understand these concepts will elevate their remote teaching abilities. The first principle is instructional time. Students should need less time to complete assignments in a remote environment, and teachers should use this knowledge deliberately in their planning. For example, a 90-minute class in a traditional school environment may be replaced by a 30 to 45-minute experience in a virtual setting. Teachers may engage students in direct instruction for 20 to 30 minutes, then guided practice for 10 to 15 minutes before releasing them from the synchronous environment to the asynchronous independent practice.
Principle 2 is connection to families and students. Schools do much more than educate. They are a hub of our communities. They play a significant role in their students' and families' lives. The traditional face-to-face model gave students and families regular opportunities to connect with their teachers. In a remote learning environment, educators have to find other ways to connect. School leaders may utilize social media like Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube Live to connect with families. They may connect with students via phone calls or video chat.
Principle 3 is about engaging your students. If you can't capture their full attention, students are not going to learn the standards. And that can be harder to do in a remote learning environment. To make things trickier, remote learning doesn't just mean online. Students without internet access must be engaged too. One strategy that can engage both groups of students is making the learning relevant. Students engage in work that interests them and has meaning. For example, high school students can research which types of businesses have flourished the most since March 2020 to determine the best places to apply for a summer job.
Principle 4 is equity, choice, and flexibility. Every child is different. In this new environment, students may be learning more independently, sharing devices with multiple siblings, providing child care for younger siblings, and coping with parents who are suddenly unemployed. Teachers should design instruction with choice and flexibility in mind. Your students may feel overwhelmed, disinterested, and/or even frustrated. They have different comfort levels with technology and may be using a multitude of different devices. Expect this and build your instructional plan with extra flexibility so that each child can learn in a way that works for them. Include time specifically to address students' individual needs.
Principle 5 is collaboration among students. Traditional school naturally creates social interactions and collaborations between students. They learn with and from others. Now, it's your job to ensure this happens multiple times each week, even in a simple way. For example, you can ask your teacher to have students build a shared presentation and post it so the class can provide feedback and comments, making edits as they receive feedback from their peers.
Principle 6 is feedback on student work. Feedback has a powerful impact on student learning and motivation. It's essential that this continues in a remote learning environment, even though it requires a more intentional approach than a quick walk around the classroom. When teachers are deliberate about giving regular and timely feedback, it not only helps students, but also helps the teacher keep track of how each student is progressing in their learning. Failure to give feedback up front will result in more wasted time in the long run.
Finally, Principle 7 is social and emotional learning. Addressing students' social and emotional lives has been proven to increase achievement. This is never more important than during a crisis. It is essential that educators remind students they are not alone and have support from their school community. In a remote setting, this could be accomplished by sharing video announcements to help students feel a sense of consistency. Or for students lacking broadband access, staff can create a telephone schedule to check on those families. As everyone adjusts to the new normal of remote learning, we hope these 7 instructional design principles are useful in helping your educators meet the North Carolina professional teaching standards. In March of 2020, the school system went into emergency mode. The school year, as we knew it, came to an abrupt end. Many districts stopped evaluating their students in favor of an enrichment and engagement model. Similarly, principals may have stopped evaluating their teachers as they had before. But evaluating teachers still matters. Let's take a tried and true feedback model and apply it to our new remote context.
The North Carolina Educator Evaluation System, or NCEES, was created to define, support, and assess behaviors, practices, and attributes that are critical for educators to be successful. It's an annual evaluation process with 2 components, supervision and evaluation. Supervision is defined as the formative support to assess, refine, and improve teacher practice. In a remote environment, supervision looks a little different. We'll get into that in a few minutes. Evaluation is a summative judgment of all evidence collected throughout the year to provide an overall rating on the teacher's performance on a specific standard. This evaluation piece uses a rubric that consists of two types of standards, professional standards and instructional standards. What's the difference?
This is something a lot of principals don't recognize the nuance of. The evaluation process addresses two specific areas, professional practice and instructional practice. And the professional practices are the actions that the teacher takes to develop and maintain productive professional relationships with staff, students, parents, and the school community, as well as demonstrate and promote their ethical practices to model and maintain professional standards. The instructional practices are those activities, events, and resources that are designed, structured, and organized by a teacher to present information and appropriately engage students in academic content and assess the achievement of learning outcomes. So, observation is essential to assess instructional practice and professional practice. And while most educators refer to the NCEES rubrics completed throughout the year as observation rubrics, only a portion of the information collected on these rubrics comes from the direct observation of instruction. There are more than 244 individual descriptors of practice in the NCEES rubric. Of these, 108 are specifically visible during a teacher's instruction. Information to assess the remaining behaviors has to come from activities and events that occur outside of the instructional event. This is the piece principals are going to have to be aware of, because it's one thing to pile in a Zoom meeting and collect those 108 descriptors. But there's the other 55% that I got to figure out where I'm going to see. When I was in a building, I could walk down the hall and peek in a PLC. When and where am I going to see those things? That professional practice aspect, principals and HR directors are more worried about observing synchronous instruction. I think it's not even on the radar screen of a lot of principals about worrying about the professional practices, and they're 55% of the rubric. So that's why understanding this is important. So observation is essential to assess both of these teacher practice types. The information about instructional practices gets collected through observations and the review of activities, events, and resources that the teachers use in their classrooms to engage students in academic content and assess their achievement of those learning outcomes. To assess professional practices, evaluators must observe a teacher's interactions with staff, students, and parents within the broader school community. Finding that broader school community in remote and blended contexts is going to take work. How do I see that teacher to parent interaction now that everything is online? Because I still have standards that say I should be assessing it. How do I get a lens into it so it's available to me?
Let's dive deeper into the concepts Robert Sachs was discussing. Professional practices comprise about 55% of the NCEES rubric and are addressed in Standards 1 and 5. Instructional practices comprise the remaining 45% of the rubric and are addressed in Standards 2, 3, and 4.
Each of these standards is rated on a 4-part scale, from developing to distinguished. Accurately rating teachers with this scale requires you really understand them. For example, look at the developing rating. The amount of knowledge a teacher has in their head is not something you can directly observe in a classroom. Likewise, for the distinguished rating, the teacher's extension, or their impact on the wider school community, happens outside the classroom.
So where do we look for these evidences in our new remote learning environment? Let's hear from Marcus Gauss on how he plans to work with his school leadership to clarify what evidences look like for each element and its rating.
So we have an instructional leadership team, and that team has been looking at how we go about making sure that we communicate those expectations virtually and adding those evidences or look-fors for each of those elements. The last couple of days, they've been kind of dropping in classes because they've been added as either co-teachers or invited to participate in those virtual classes. They've really been documenting things. We're sharing out those things that we have been able to find and are putting those back into a format that we'll eventually be able to share with teachers that says, this is what it looks like in the event that you use a group in your teams. So this would be developing. And if you utilize this group by adding this component, this would what would be proficient. They're categorizing it so that it aligns very well to the standards and also their evaluation levels.
Let's look at the nuts and bolts of supervising teachers in a remote environment. Remote instruction is generally made up of two components. The first is synchronous, or same-time instruction, that happens live. This is most similar to a traditional classroom experience. The other component is asynchronous, or anytime instruction, which allows students and parents to view a lesson whenever they want and access support multiple times if needed.
Administrators need to consider both when looking for evidences. For synchronous virtual instruction, many districts are using video conferencing tools like Zoom, Google Meet, or Microsoft Teams to deliver instruction. Observing these live sessions may be most useful when collecting evidence for instructional standards, including standards 2, 3, and 4.
Asynchronous instruction, on the other hand, may include teachers working with students in learning management systems like Canvas, Schoology, or Google Classrooms. We'll call these LMS for short. An asynchronous environment can utilize feedback as a great tool for learning, both teacher to student and student to student. An administrator looking for evidence of element 4B or 4H could examine an assessment in Canvas where they look for timely feedback aimed at providing students with a way to improve and learn. Another option is to have students provide feedback to peers by posting comments on assignments or collaborating virtually on Google Docs. As an administrator, this can provide evidence of student learning for elements 4H or 4F.
A virtual call log may be an artifact that administrators use to collect evidence of element 2E, or teacher communication. This is an example of asynchronous professional practice that could not be seen in the classroom. There are several ways to gauge the quality of remote instruction in an asynchronous format. Administrators may search the LMS for examples of teacher-created videos that show the teacher modeling or demonstrating a skill to their students. School leaders could also review student work in an LMS looking for examples of remote student collaboration or element 4F, like a Google Doc with comments from other classmates that are a result of student learning teams. Administrators should also look for evidence of teacher professional interactions. Professional learning community meetings among grade levels and departments can be hosted in virtual spaces. That could mean a synchronous meeting attended by all administrators and teachers, or having smaller teams hold meetings and take minutes. You can review those later to collect evidences from Standard 1 or 5. Whew, that was a lot. Don't forget, you can rewatch any part of this video anytime you want to reinforce what we learned today.
Thanks for watching this webinar on evaluating teachers in a remote learning environment. This has been a presentation of NCPAPA, the North Carolina Principals and Assistant Principals Association.
So Shayla and Brad, what are some things that you have noticed about conducting evaluations in a remote learning environment?
I'll start off. First of all, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this very relevant topic. At our school, we're an elementary school of about 500 students, and right now we are on Plan A. So we have students that are able to come 5 days a week, but we have about 30% of our students, or about 140, that are opting to be remote only. So I have about one classroom teacher per grade level that is operating as a remote only teacher. And, you know, what we've noticed is that obviously it's a much different environment. In the spring, when we were tossed into this remote world, everything happened pretty rapidly. very little preparation. We in Rutherford County were a bit blessed because we have been a one-to-one district for a number of years. We have iPads for our elementary students and middle school students, and MacBooks for the high school students. So they were already familiar to a point, but still, when you operate that in a face-to-face learning environment versus purely remotely, it's a totally different thing. Our elementary students did not take their devices home before the remote world came about. So they really were tossed in pretty quickly. But as we've started this year, we've learned from those mistakes. We've defined our expectations for remote learning. And I think that was one key piece with our district is we laid out what are the expectations for both teachers, what are the expectations for students who participate. And as you use that in the context of looking through the evaluation process, it defines the parameters of what expectations are, which helps us to be able to communicate better with the teachers.
Thank you. So, good morning. I'm Shayla Savage again, and thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity as well. We are still 100% remote. I'm in a middle school in Gifford County, and our 6th graders will be entering back into the building starting on January the 7th, and then our 7th and 8th graders will be returning beginning on January 11th. So this has been a very, very fun experience. We were one-to-one a couple of years back, but we are not anymore. So just from getting devices out, getting them back, we've given out quite a few hotspots as well, as the internet can become a barrier. But what we've noticed is you have to be an entertainer. You can't get on the remote learning environment and be Charlie Brown's teacher. Students come to classes that they enjoy being in attendance at. So we have really worked a lot on how do we keep our students engaged? How do you continuously do different activities throughout the lesson while keeping their attention and their focus, in addition to checking for understanding. We also have done a lot this time, which we feel like is very important for teachers to be able to intentionally make a social and emotional connection with students. The remote learning is hard for staff as well as for our students. So at each lesson, we do make a point to ensure that we do something just that connects with our social emotional beings with our students. And though we don't require them to turn on their cameras, we do like to see their faces, at least get a wave, make sure that everything is okay. So, and then the very last thing is teachers have got to feel confident in what they're teaching, because lots of times when you're teaching to just a black screen and no one's responding, but maybe just in the chat, you have to really, really have lots of confidence about what you're talking about, because that can be a truly, truly daunting task. So those are some of the things that we have truly noticed about while we're conducting evaluations in the remote learning environment.
Thank you. So how are you setting the stage for the evaluation process with your remote teachers, or teachers who are teaching online? How are you setting the stage with how things are different or how they may change?
Well, I found that, even though it is much different, the process for setting that stage should be like any other evaluation process. When you do your pre-observation conferences at the beginning of the year and you sit down and you talk about what are your needs as a teacher? What do you are you concerned about? What is it that you're feeling good about? What is it that you have a need for support? All those type of things. And you just sort of have to change up what you're looking for. It is a much different world. Shayla said it really well, and what she was going through, and the way that we communicate is different than it is when you're face to face. You have to, because you're pulling in an audience rather than having a captive audience, so to speak. But I think that at the same time, when you sit down and you have those beginning of the year conferences with the teachers, that's where you set the stage. And I think they're all in a learning process for sure. So, the great thing about the evaluation process is it's a growth process. And they're going to be, I always tell teachers every year, there's times when you may have taught the same grade for 5, 6, 7 years, and then I switch you to another grade. And your ratings may change a bit because you're new at something. And basically that's what's happening in a remote evaluation process too. There's some areas that they're going to excel in because that's naturally comfortable. And then there's other things that are new. And some of that's just the process of giving some grace as you're going into watching them, learning from them as well, because obviously as administrators, we're new to the remote evaluation process. So we have to ourselves sort of learn on the fly, but I think it has to be a give and take and an open conversation from the beginning, and then certainly throughout and following up, and just listening to the teacher as much as trying to give that specific suggestions about how they can improve.
And this school year as well, we did go through the evaluation tool, just each element in full detail as to what that would look like in the remote learning setting. We also have Tech Friday meetings in which the assistant principal shows different technology tools that can be used and how that tool could absolutely relate to the element that you're trying to reach, which has been extremely helpful. I could give you a quick example. We've done a lot on, there's an element that talks about working in a small group. So what does that look like online? What does that look like to have the breakout rooms, or what does it look like to ensure that different groups of students are working on a part that completes a whole? So we have intentionally this year looked at each element and worked as a staff to discover ways that that element would apply in the remote learning setting.
Great. So how have the changes in moving to a remote learning environment impacted how you collect evidences for each element?
Personally, I think it's actually become easier because there's so much more there technology-wise, and they are doing things that are easier for them as teachers to be able to just quickly either record something or to share something digitally. One of the things, because we have some remote students who have great connectivity and others who don't, our expectations have been in Canvas, they set up their weekly lessons, and they're supposed to be posted by 4 o'clock the Friday before. And the reason for that is because there's some families that don't have connectivity at home. We have Wi-Fi hotspots at the school. They can come to the school parking lot. They can download that week's content, make sure that any videos that are there are downloaded, and they have it on their device to be able to take back home without Wi-Fi connectivity. And with that means front-end preparation. And we've always had expectations for lesson planning and those type of things, but it's a lot more structured, and because it has to be prepared and make sure you're communicating not just with the child of what they need to do, but with the parent who has to be there to support. So that in and of itself becomes an evidence. Are they getting their lessons in place? Are they how are their videos laid out? What communication tools are they using? Plus, there's so much with the students not being present, they have to do a lot more documentation of what kind of contacts are being made, those type of things. So when it comes to that day-to-day sort of, again, more documentation of the elements is really personally, in a lot of ways, a lot easier to do than when they're in the building, when you just sort of take that for granted and the kids are there and it's not necessarily quite as natural. So I've actually found that to be more of an advantage when it comes to evidence collection.
I would agree with Brad there, especially having the option to record and having teachers to go back with you and look at certain parts where you want to really hone in on a skill or a strategy that they taught, whether it be a grow or glow. In addition to just the days of parking lot planning are gone now, because you have to truly be prepared in this virtual environment. So for us as well, it's been a lot easier to just look and see what the actual elements are that they are looking and working towards improving, and sitting down with them, looking at them teach, because when you're in that live setting, you don't get the opportunity to do that. So in some ways, shapes and forms, this has truly been a blessing, because they get an opportunity now to see themselves in quote unquote real time. And you can get that address and you can see improvements made a lot quicker just through the use of the technology.
And also, just to piggyback on that, in a more informal way, not so much the actual scheduled evaluation, but being able to pop in on a Zoom meeting is good. I mean, we certainly do that in the regular classroom setting when they're physically in the building. So you walk around from one class to the other, and you stop by every once in a while to see what's going on and check up on them. Well, you can do that, sitting in your desk in your office, to do the same thing and come into a Zoom meeting, because they have those, we have access to what time their Zoom meetings are and what's going on and those type of things. So I think it gives us the ability to be able to stay connected in a different way, but still I've almost looked at it as it's the same thing but different in a lot of ways. And yes, there's some areas that I'm sure we'll discuss are harder to do, but in some ways I'll try to make it as normal as possible. Again, whether it's the formal evaluation part of things or just the informal staying connected with them too.
And it's just a great opportunity for growth and immediate feedback, which lots of times we didn't have. And just like Brad said, I have a spreadsheet with all the Zoom links. I just jump on. I might get on 6 classes in 1 hour, just jumping back and forth to see what's going on. And if I have 2 or 3 devices up, I can look and see what's going on kind of all at the same time in multiple classrooms. So that's been a very good experience, because of course, when you're at the building, it's only one of you and you can only touch one place at a time. So that's been I've seen that as a positive as well.
Great. So you guys have accentuated some of the positives of the new context of remote learning. So my next question is going to be, what are some of the biggest hurdles that you're noticing with those observations in this remote learning environment? And then maybe some of those things that you've done to address those challenges.
I think effective communication, and it's like that with any teacher's classroom. Again, you're really comparing face to face to remote in our conversation, but you have those teachers who, from a classroom management standpoint, it's a natural thing, and they have structures in place and expectations from the very beginning. And those who've done that in a remote setting end up having a much more successful remote learning environment as well. So when they, students have the ability to tune in and tune out in remote, which is not quite as acceptable in the face-to-face environment. They can cut off that video and you really don't know who's on the other side of that. Like Shayla said, we don't really dictate that they have to be on the video at all times. So you really don't know what's happening on the other side. Plus, you have the issue of what's happening in the background at home. In some cases, there are multiple siblings that they're all learning at the same time, and you can actually hear other teachers teaching and or parents who are trying to do their daily expectations and routines, and the issue of when do you mute, when do you not mute, all those kind of things that become so much more difficult to juggle and in a different way. So, you know, I've gone in and I've observed teachers who have done a tremendous job with that, who had really great expectations, and they reinforce those throughout. They would remind their kids every day, you know, this is what we're going to do. This is the way we behave. This is what I want you to do to participate in this is two-way communication in remote learning. And then others who've struggled more. And, you know, I think that same thing, again, whether it's face-to-face or remote, it's going to happen. And the great thing is, you know, when you, as a principal, have been able to see where it works, you can pull in those examples to that teacher who may be struggling and say, hey, I saw a teacher the other day that did this strategy to get her kids really engaged and involved. You may want to go talk to them, or, you know, share those examples. And so I think, again, it's a learning process, but everybody's got their own way. There's not one right way to set that up. But you can kind of, when you're an outside observer looking in, you can see, yeah, this is working, or no, they're struggling a little bit with it. So, you know, they really have to do it differently. But I think it's very doable once they get into a routine.
I would agree with Brad. You have to be very concise and clear with your communication, as well as with your instructions when you're teaching virtually. If not, it becomes a little bit of chaos. So it's like, what did you say? And what did you do? And then somebody's speaking in the background and you can hear other things. So you have to be very intentional to say, this is the way that we conduct business in our classroom, just as you would as if we were in the actual face-to-face setting. The other thing is you have to be intentional about touching all of the elements, which could be a hurdle in the virtual learning environment as well. You have to make sure you're trying to do something that promotes the group. You have to do something that shows that you're looking to see if your assessment is working and what data you can collect while you're observing. So all of those things, they have to truly be intentional, very intentional in the virtual environment to make sure that they're hitting all of the elements. And the very last thing that I talk to my teachers about all the time is just imagine any and everything that you say is out there for the whole world to see. So be mindful of what you say, your facial expressions, how you comment back. Just know that this video can go viral at any time. And I need you to teach with that in mind.
Great.
And that's a huge stressor for teachers too. I mean, that is one of the things that I have to sort of counsel with them about is, you know, how, I mean, it's hard to be a teacher in any setting, but when you feel like you're being critiqued constantly on the other side, you know, they get it. Teachers a lot of times are really comfortable speaking with their students and talking within their four walls, and now all of a sudden it's like they're being observed every day, you know, and most of the time by parents. And
by parents, they're there listening.
Right, they're listening, they're watching, and they'll be really quick sometimes to give me a call and say, well, teacher said such and such, or they did this or that. And you know, that's something too, that's an education process. I know it's not so much the point of this conversation, but I've had to have conversations with parents and explain, you know, it's a management piece. You know, when your child gets muted, it's not that they don't want to hear your child, but when you're doing a whole class situation, every child can't talk all the time, and we have to be able to manage that. But it also goes back to that issue of communication. When you do have those students who may be challenged with their own ability to effectively communicate in that whole group setting that you're doing a Zoom, you do sort of have to figure out, well, how do I make sure that I take a note? If they're struggling, I can tell they're struggling, I can tell they're not getting what I am trying to teach them, then make sure I follow up with them later on. You know, all of our teachers have these open office hours or individual sessions that they need to make a note. And that's one of the things I really reiterate with them every time. If you have that child that you know didn't connect, find a way to connect with them later on so that they get what you're trying to teach.
Mhm.
So I know that both of you have shared some of your challenges, and I know you're doing some great things at your school. So maybe you could share some of the things that you've done that have had the biggest impact on conducting evaluations.
You know, at my school, like I said, we're operating in kind of a weird world right now where I have individual teachers on one teacher per grade that's remote, and then the others that are not, and making sure that they're connected with the greater community is a challenge. And I think that's one of the things that I've seen is that our teachers who are remote are really in some ways trying to operate a full day of instruction, and I rarely see them come out of their in front of their computer, and sometimes being able to really work with them and remind them that, okay, it's okay to have some moments where you step away from that. You know, you've got your scheduled time, but you can't schedule every second of the day. You've got to be able to breathe, and you got to be able to have a conversation with your colleagues and keep them connected. So I think in part, you know, for us, it's just trying to keep the community that's operating in two different ways going together and staying together, rather than having two different cohorts of learning going on. I don't know that so much answered the question, but I think it's just how you know, we have to face those challenges. And you know, when it comes to the actual evaluation itself in a remote setting, where it's appropriate, I've tried to actually physically be in the room where they are actually teaching, because it's great to be on the other side of the computer watching that Zoom, which I'm still doing too. So I can see, all right, well, this is what the audience on the other side is seeing. But I also want to see the environment that they've set up for themselves, how they've organized their own workspace, and how they, you know, juggle all the balls when they're trying to do that. And you can't really see that when you're outside the room. Sometimes that may not be appropriate, but a lot of times it has. And I think that's helped me to help them, especially if they're struggling with something, to sort of say, all right, well, I noticed this when I was there, seeing this on the other side of the screen, you know, what that looked like and how I could help you. So I try to do that rather than sitting in my office only. And I think that's helped as well.
I think one of the biggest things that we've done, it's been very helpful to take those elements and to determine how they would be relatable or acceptable in the remote learning environment. Additionally, we've had model teachers, just like you would in a face-to-face environment, where we've recorded and played a segment of them showing their engagement and how excited they were and how their kids were responding. We've had teachers go in and co-teach together where we wouldn't normally have that opportunity to do that. So they can get ideas and they can see how that person organizes their schedule and their class for that day. We have had some of our coaches go in just like we would in a face-to-face environment and teach the class and let the teachers just sit and take notes, and it would be recorded and they can do that as well. So we are still using some of those traditional ways, but we're just using it through the virtual learning environment to ensure that we have an opportunity to show teachers exactly what we are expecting to see when we visit their remote classroom. And then the very last thing, just doing our Tech Friday program and presenting different technology options, as well as being very accessible so they can come in and ask just very quick and short questions that will help them have a better virtual environment, learning environment setting. And so those are just some of the ways, and those tech tools, they're not always, it could be like a quiz that you can do to get a short assessment. It can be, how do you set this PowerPoint up so they won't have to log out of Canvas and come back in? So it's all of those short and quick, sweet ways to show teachers you can still be very successful in this environment if you are using your tools and maximizing them.
Great, thank you. So I know that, Shayla, you mentioned knowing about the elements. And so my next question is, are there any standards or elements in the NCEES rubric that you have had found challenging to find evidences for? And if so, if you could share some of those.
You know, I've thought about this question in terms of, are there any that really don't apply? And they really all do, which is great. You know, I think it's, again, how your perspective on it and how you look at it. They have to be adapted. You have to maybe be a little more creative in some particular rating areas in each element. But I think one thing that we do have, I think most teachers are struggling with, and it's not so much that it would necessarily affect their evaluation, but it was, you know, when you're trying to come up with a variety of assessments in a remote setting, the validity of assessments on the other side of what we've traditionally used is difficult because you really don't know what's happening with the kids at home. So when we're used to giving standard, you know, quizzes and tests and say, here you go, and you're getting back results, you kind of go, is this really what this child is doing? Or are they doing something that they wouldn't be able to do their peers if they were face to face? So being able to take, it takes more time, so they know they have to ask direct questions and engage directly with the students where they can see them and they hear them and they know what's happening. And, you know, when you think about your, you know, end of unit quizzes or standardized assessments, for sure, you know, you really are more limited on the data that you get back. And then you're going, as a teacher, if you don't have true valid assessment data, you don't know what your kids know and what they don't know. And I think that's what I've heard a lot of my teachers are struggling with. And they think, you know, I've got this child that does very little, if anything, so I don't really know what they know. And then on the other hand, you've got one that's making everything seems to be perfect, but yet you look back at previous records for them and they weren't necessarily straight A students. So, you know, I think it's, again, not so much that the teachers are struggling with it, but they've had to adapt to the fact that assessments just aren't as clear in giving them the necessary information about their students' performance as they used to be.
The assessment truly has been a challenge. Just getting students to come in and take the assessments as far as online, that's been a challenge. Then the other issue is we truly don't know who's taking that assessment on the other end and how much assistance they are or not getting. And then just using a variety of them, that's been a struggle as well. The data has been hard to recognize. The assessments, them working together as a group, those three are consistently coming up in every single observation as to how do I do this and do it effectively.
Great, thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
So my final question for the two of you is, given what you know about teaching in a remote learning environment, what advice would you give some of your principal friends about the NCEES evaluation process?
So can I go back? I know what the other one was now. It was the collaborating with the specialists and how can that be shown in a virtual learning if it's not with the inclusion teacher, especially a teacher like in the inclusion setting? How does it look meeting or collaborating with the specialists? How does that look in a virtual learning environment setting? So that one has been a challenge as well too. So sorry, but that was going to bother me. I couldn't figure out what it was.
So I'm actually going to repeat that question so we can, just to make sure we have that piece. Thank you for your responses. Mm-hmm. Given what you know now about teaching in a remote learning environment, what advice would you give to perhaps some of your principal friends about the NCEES evaluation process?
So I would say just, you know, keep in mind that with anything else, I use the term at the beginning, give some grace, you know, the fact that this isn't You know, this isn't something necessarily that most of our teachers have been trained in some use of technology, for sure, but the level of this and the intensity of it is so much greater than anybody was ready for. And I think we all have to be very proud of where we are as school, in education as a whole, to be able to adapt in such a pretty short period of time. And with all that being said, when you sit down at the evaluation system, it's meant to be a growth model. It's meant to be one where you give feedback and you say, these are things you're doing well, these are things that you need to work on. But keep in mind too, that even as a principal, we're learning what is a remote learning environment ourselves. And we have to be able to evaluate it appropriately. We have to really know it. And I think we're in the process of learning it too. So, you know, you just kind of have to juggle putting it in the context of this is relatively new to the level that we're doing this. We've all done it to some extent, but in some ways you would always look at that element of technology, and that's the only thing you really looked at. Now you're looking at it all and together and all encompassing. So, you know, I really think in a way, we as principals have to learn from each other. We have to talk to our peers. We have to say, how's it going at your school? What are you doing? So that we give a fair evaluation and give appropriate feedback, so that it becomes something that's not, you know, punitive. Because, you know, you look at it particularly, you know, in my school where I have only a certain percentage of the teachers that are working remote and everybody else is more of a traditional way, you've got to be equitable and fair in terms of, you know, how do we give you, because I've asked you to do something, because most of my teachers, when it came out, when I had to say who wants to be remote, I didn't have a ton of hands going up. You know, I had to kind of twist some arms and convince some people and to say, you know, I think you'd be great at this. So, you know, it really is a learning process. And I think, you know, we want to give appropriate feedback and you know, use it to the tool for what it was meant to be, as a growth model.
I say be flexible, be positive, see it as an opportunity and not a challenge. Also show grace and mercy. We know, just like this morning, we had a couple of technology glitches, and it's going to happen. So let's be positive and work through it and make sure that they can continue on without us being harsh and very critical of those things. And just understand that this is new for everyone. And that the longer and the more that we do it, the better we will become. That's the advice that I would give.